Okay, in this video we're going to dive into JavaScript functions. Okay, so I have my Atom text editor here. I'm going to open a new file and just call this functions.js. And to declare a function, we use the function keyword, function, and then we specify an identifier. We've talked about identifiers before. They're everywhere in JavaScript. The simplest example of an identifier is when we declare a variable. So the identifier it's the same idea. You just name the function, and it must start with an alphabetical character or an underscore, but you can have numeric values in the identifier as well. It just can't start with a numeric value. All right, so we have function add 5, right? And then left and right parentheses, and then any parameters to the function. Okay, so what data does this function expect? All right, and then to specify the code block representing what actually runs, what lines of code run when we call this function, we have to surround that with curly braces. Okay, so here we're going to have a function called add5 that takes in one value, x. Okay, and the expectation here is that x is going to be an integer. All right, so what we can do here is we can say we want to add 5 to whatever value we're given, right? So x plus 5. So if I were to run this function right now, if I were to call it, I could say add 5. And remember, we call functions using the identifier name of the function, then left and right parentheses. And we can pass in a value here. I can pass in the value 7. Okay, so the function definition does not run this code. This code only runs when we call the function, and we can call the function multiple different ways. So we could have add 5, 7, and then add 5 passing in 13. All right, so what happens with this function call? 7 is an argument. So we pass in the value 7 as an argument. What does the argument do? Well, first, JavaScript, as it's executing code, it executes the top line down, right? So there's nothing on the first line, then it sees a function declaration or a definition, right? This is not executing the function, but defining the behavior of the function, okay? So whenever you see something like this, none of the code in the code body is going to run until you call it, all right? Now this is a parameter. It's different than an argument. The argument is the data you send in when you call. The parameter is the identifier associated in the function definition. Okay, so the argument 7 is passed in and it's stored in the parameter x. Okay, so that's a key distinction, right? Let's say function calls pass in arguments, right? And then function definitions define parameters. There we go. All right, and this, notice how this is grayed out in my text editor. Anything that starts with // that's considered a comment. All right, so we have comments in our code that helps us explain what's going on. So the JavaScript parser does not try to parse this as if it were a line of code. It skips over it. Anything with 2 slashes in front of it. So that's the comment characters we're going to use. There are a couple other ways to use comments, but for now this is by far the most useful. And in Atom you can select a lot of code. Let's say we had another line here, and if I wanted to comment out all this code so it doesn't execute, I can hit Control/, and Atom automatically adds comments in front of this. So now this is going to be ignored. But if I want to run the program again, I can hit Control/, and if I want this code to run, then I would remove those comments. Okay, so in general, it's a good practice to almost exclusively use the slashes because most text editors have that sort of functionality where you can highlight and comment or uncomment. All right. And again, I highly recommend Atom or Visual Studio Code or Sublime Text, anything like that. Use some sort of professional text editor that's been built to use as a text editor for computer science. All right, so we have this function definition, add 5, we pass in the argument 7. So then 7 is stored in the parameter x. Then JavaScript begins executing this, the code in this function, right? There's only one line of code, and it's x plus 5. Now the problem with this is x plus 5, we have the value 7 stored in x, so this gets evaluated as 7 plus 5, right? So that's going to be 12, but then we don't do anything with that value, right? We don't return that value from this function. We don't print it with console.log. We don't do anything with it. So I can call all of these functions, right? The definition of what happens is up here, and then here is when I'm actually calling the function to execute that code. And if we run this, we see it looks like nothing happened, right? That's not entirely true. This calculation did occur. JavaScript executed this expression. We just didn't do anything with the result. So really what we want to do is probably let result equal the result of evaluating this expression, right? So now we have a variable that's holding our value. Now what do we want to do with that? Well, we can say console.log and log the result. And now we see our function add5 has added 5 to each one of the arguments. Okay? So it's important to note that JavaScript executes one line at a time. So again, as it goes through here, it sees function keyword. So it knows we're defining a function, right? And we've just defined it. By the time JavaScript reaches this line, we've defined the function, but the code within the function has not executed. You only do that with a function call. So here we're calling the function for the first time. We pass in a 7 as an argument. So when you call a function, whatever arguments you pass into that particular function call, the value gets stored in the parameter associated. So we could have multiple values here. I could have, 5, and then we could have x and y, right? But that would be a different function. So then the 7 argument would be stored in the x parameter. The 5 argument would be stored in the y parameter, right? But for this example, we're going to just stick to one argument and one parameter. All right, so we pass in 7. X stores that 7. We execute lines of JavaScript. This is a 7 in this particular function call. X is a 7, so that's 7 plus 5. That's going to be 12. So result is storing the value 12, and then we can console.log the result, right? And that's why we see 12 here. Okay. Now notice we didn't return any value from the function. All right. So we say add 5, and then add 5 to 13. Now this is a brand new function call. So the argument we're passing in is 13. So that is what's getting stored in x. So 13 plus 5 is going to be 18. And that's going to be stored in result. Then we log that, which is why we see an 18 here. And then the function block has ended, right? The curly brackets define the code inside of our function, right? So anytime you have a function definition, the code block should be indented. Now it's not required in JavaScript, but it does make your code easier to read. So absolutely, you should always indent your code inside of the curly brackets. Now there's something called code minifiers that basically shrink down your program so it's smaller when you send it over the web, right? So this is technically a valid JavaScript function. It's just hard for humans to read. I could have lots of different lines here, and this is why semicolons are important, because this is one line of code, semicolon, another line of code, semicolon, and so this can run just the same as the others. But you should never define your code like this. This is only for minifying your code so that it takes up less space when you're trying to transmit it over the internet, right? So all of these spaces here, all of these indentations are removed, right? So that's called minification. So JavaScript allows for that, but you should not write your code that way. All right, so whenever you have a function block, always indent. All right, you can do 2 or 4 spaces. 4 is probably best if you're just starting out coding. All right, so this function call, console.log, so we executed add 5, passed in 7, executed add 5, passed in 13, and so now the function block has ended. We already printed out the result, which was 18, and so now JavaScript moves to this line. Now we have another function call of add 5. We pass in 23, the parameter x becomes 23, so 23 plus 5 is 28. So result is storing 28, and then we log that out. All right, so we are printing results here. What if we wanted to add all of these together? So if I wanted to add 12, 18, and 28, okay? Maybe I could do something like this. Maybe I could just make one big expression. Okay. Now, what will happen here? I'm calling the function, and then I'm adding, calling another function, adding, calling another function. Well, what do we know about expressions? Well, in order to use the plus operator, we have to have definite values. So I don't know what the result of this is until I execute this function. Right? So I need a return value on this function. But I'm not actually returning anything from this function. I'm only printing to the terminal. Okay, so when we run this as it is, all we see is each one of these individual functions being called. And then we could try to console.log the result of this. So in this case, this is one big expression that's going to evaluate to one value, and we're going to try to log that out. Okay, we get this interesting value, NaN, stands for not a number. Okay, that is what you get. Let's run node in interactive mode. Undefined is returned by functions by default if they don't return a value. So what is undefined plus undefined? Not a number. What is not a number plus undefined? That's also not a number. So this is what's happening. This function does not return a value. So since we don't explicitly use the return keyword here, that means it's going to return undefined. And then this one is the same function, so it doesn't return a value either. We just have a different argument passed in, right? So this is undefined plus undefined is going to equal not a number, and then not a number plus undefined is not a number. All right? And then when we log that out, this is all just one expression that gets evaluated. We log that out, and it prints out not a number, right? So really what we want to do here is probably add a return value. We're going to return the result. Okay? Now in this way, whatever's stored in result is going to actually replace the function call. Okay, so here, if we have add 7, we know or add 5, we pass in the value 7, we know that results in the number 12. So this is essentially going to be replaced with 12. Right? And then add 5, if we pass in 13, we know that's 18. So this is essentially going to be replaced with 18. And that's because of the return statement. The return statement tells you what the function evaluates to. All right? So now, instead of undefined plus undefined plus undefined, we're going to have the actual result values calculated in the function. Each one of these is going to be different. Okay? Each time you call the function, the parameter x is storing a different value based on what you passed in. All right, so let's exit out of interactive mode and then run our functions. Okay, so this is the sum of 12 plus 18, that's 30, plus 28 is 58. Okay. Now, what if you didn't want to log this out each time inside add 5? You just wanted the function to add 5. Well, then we can just comment out this console.log. And all we really want to log out is this. Okay, so you see the difference? Because we had console.log in the definition, right? Every time we called the function, we logged out that result, right? But in a lot of cases, most cases, you're not going to want to log things in every single function call. You just want the function to accomplish the task that it's supposed to do. So this function, the task it's supposed to do is to add 5 to any number you give it, right? So we can very easily do that. Let result, right? And we could make this even simpler. We could just say return x plus 5, right? And that is just a really simple one-line function. However, if we decide that we might want to play with the console.log in here, it's better to store that value in a variable, and then that way we can log that out and then return that variable. Okay, so when we return a variable, we're not actually returning the variable, we're returning the value stored in that variable. Okay, that's an important distinction as well. All right, run this again. See, that's 58. So another point of interest, we have this expression here, console.log, but we're passing in sort of a long expression, and we might want to add some more stuff here. We might want to say the sum of function calls, something like this. So now all of a sudden, because we added this sort of label into our log statement, it's getting kind of long, right? So just looking at this at a glance, it's a little bit hard to tell what's going on. So it might be better to take this expression and pull it out and store it in a variable. So we might call this let sum equal, and we're gonna copy all of this, highlight it, Control C or Control X to cut, and then Control V to paste. Right? And that depends on your operating system, of course. If you're on a Mac, it's Command C and Command V. But we paste that, and then we can just type in sum here. Now this is a little bit cleaner now. It's not so cluttered. All right? So sometimes, if you have very complicated expressions, it's good to pull out components of that expression and store them in a variable and name the variable something that makes sense. So this is the sum of all of the function calls, right? And now I can use that instead of having this full expression in this console.log statement. So this is a little cleaner, it's a little bit easier to read. So it's always a good idea to try to simplify your code, take different pieces of a very complicated expression and make little variables that are named appropriately to help you understand what's going on in your code. So I can save this and print that, run the program and the sum of function calls, right? That's a very simple function call. So there's other ways to define functions. You can also have a situation where we say let multiply by 2. So I'm declaring a variable here, but I'm going to set that equal to a function. Okay, so here this is a function definition, and notice we don't have a semicolon at the end of a function definition. If we define a function using the function keyword, we don't have a semicolon. But here, anytime you have a function or a variable declaration, you do need a semicolon. So here, I'm creating a variable, but I'm setting that variable equal to a function. Now this function does not have a name. Right here, function name. This function does not have a name, but essentially, since we are setting it equal to a variable, suddenly this basically becomes the identifier of the function. All right, so this is just a slightly different way of defining a function, but you will see it a lot. So it's important that you understand that these are two different ways of defining functions, but this is particularly useful when you are setting a function to a property of an object or something like this. But this is really common. You have a variable or you have defined a property on an object and you set that equal to an anonymous function. This is an anonymous function because it has no name. Right? So normally up here we would have function and then the function name. Right? But this has no name, so they call this an anonymous function. Right? But the syntax is mostly the same. You have the function keyword, left and right parentheses, and then you have your curly braces to designate what the body of the code is, right? So this would be simple. We would return multiply by 2. We would have some, y value or something. We can use anything. We can reuse x here if we want. We could say x, and this is going to be x times 2, multiply by 2. And this is going to return the result of whatever we pass in. That's going to be stored in the parameter x, and then we're going to multiply it by 2 and just return that value. All right, so we can see here, let's console.log, and we're going to multiply by 2. We're going to pass in 7. So multiply by 2, if we pass in 7, should return 14. But then let's add 5 to that. Okay, so we're sort of nesting function calls here. We have the innermost function call has to be called first, because otherwise we don't know what to pass into the add 5 function. So this must be called first, so this will give us 14. Then 14 gets passed in as the argument to add 5. So 14 plus 5 should result in 19, right? So that should be the result here. 19. Okay, so that's just an alternative way of defining a function. Now there's one more way that you will see, at least on the internet, or especially when you're dealing with objects, you will see functions be defined. This is a much newer syntax. This is called the fat arrow syntax. And so similarly, you have something like let, we'll say, multiply together. And this is going to take 2 arguments, so the parameter x and the parameter y. And let is the variable. Okay, multiply together, and we're going to set that equal to a function defined like this. Okay, this is the fat arrow syntax. Fat arrow part is this equal greater than sign. That's the fat arrow. So this is a shortcut so you don't have to type out function. So you specify the parameters and then do a fat arrow in your curly braces. So this is all that it's really saving. It's preventing preventing you from having to type out function, the keyword. You can just type equal arrow. And this, while it's not that big of a deal, functions are defined constantly in JavaScript, and so the size of your code gets larger the more you use this. So 2 characters versus 8. So that might not seem like a lot, but if you have thousands of functions defined, that becomes quite a bit of data, right? So there's all these little things in JavaScript that have been added after the fact. So the original way of defining functions was this. You could also store functions in variables. And then more recently, you have this sort of syntax where you can define a function and use this fat arrow syntax. And the fat arrow syntax does have slightly different effects than a normal function definition, and we'll get into that when it comes time, but it mostly has to do with objects. Okay, so we have multiply together. This is a third function, and basically we're going to have a simple function that just multiplies the 2 provided arguments together. Okay, and here, notice that I left off my semicolon here, and the program was fine. So as I said, most JavaScript engines are extremely forgiving, but it is a really good practice to try to remember to add in all of the appropriate semicolons. All right, so we will save that and run. We haven't changed anything. We just defined this this other function. So now we need to console log something. We're going to console.log. We're going to do a multiply together. All right, and then as the arguments, we're going to do multiply by 2, 12, and then add 5, 6. Okay, so you should understand how Python, or how JavaScript, I'm sorry, how it would execute this code. So that's important and very important for you to understand. So you start looking at this as at the outermost function first, but you can never call the outermost function until you know what the values are for the innermost parts. Okay, so what's the argument for this outermost function? Well, I don't know. We have to call multiply together before we know what that is. So what's the result of multiply together? Well, we have to pass in these arguments. Well, we don't know what those are until we call these individual functions. Okay, so these functions have to be called first and evaluate to a single value, and each one of those values are passed in as arguments to the outer function, multiply together. Once we have arguments here, then we can actually execute the code defined in multiply together. Then once this entire thing executes, right, then we have an argument that we can pass in to console.log. So if we were to look at this just based on the names of these functions, what should the values be, right? So this is going to evaluate to, this is going to be 6 plus 5, so this should be 11, right? Multiply by 2, well, 12 times 2 should be 24, so this is going to be 24 and 11, right? So if you multiply those things together, it should be, what, 264? There you go. So 11 times 24 is 264. All right, so that gives you a glimpse into how JavaScript parses code, how it decides which functions to execute first. It has to always execute the innermost functions first and get single values before it can pass those values in as arguments. Okay. What else do we need to know about functions? Functions in JavaScript are what's called first-class citizens. What does that mean? That means I can pass in a function as an actual argument. Okay, so this is a little bit more complex. Actually, let's make a new file for this. We're going to call this first class. First class citizens.js. Okay, so I can make a function that says say hello, and it takes a name as a parameter, and all it does is console.log. We can say hello, comma, space, and I can concatenate two strings together, name, and then I might want to add an exclamation point. All right, so simple function. All I do is, I'm sorry, let me call this. I'm going to call say hello, and I'm going to say hello to Bob, whoever Bob is. Right? So I can run this node first class citizens, and we see it says hello Bob. Right, I'm not doing very much here. I have an argument, Bob. It's being passed in and stored in the parameter name, right? And then I log out hello, comma, space. So this is string data. I concatenate that with whatever's stored in my parameter name, and then I concatenate an exclamation point at the end, right? So it's hello, and then Bob is name, exclamation point. Not too bad. I can say hello to other folks too, right? I can say Ted. Right? Hello, Ted. Any number of names, doesn't matter. And so this function has reuse, right? I can use this for multiple different things. But I can also have another function that takes in a greeting function, right? So for this, I can say let's say I want to have a greeting. I want to pass in say hello, and I could have different greetings that I could pass in, but then I might want to pass in a way to say goodbye, right? So this function we might call say goodbye, and it might take a name and a greeting. Okay, so name is still going to be sort of a string here, but the greeting is going to be a function. So this is say hello. Let's make another function that is say howdy. So it's a slightly different greeting. Okay, and this is going to say howdy, comma, space, name, exclamation point. So this is almost exactly the same as say hello. This is a greeting function that takes in a name and it says hello to that person. Say howdy is also a greeting, but it's the phrasing is slightly different. All right. So say goodbye is going to take in the name and then the greeting function, right? So we're passing in an actual function here, not a function call, an actual function. So here we can say greeting and we pass in the name. So greeting is going to be one of these actual functions that we pass in. So greeting name, and then we'll say console.log goodbye, and then name, and then just a period. All right. So this function takes in a name and another function. So that's what we mean by first-class citizens. We can pass functions in directly as arguments. All right, so for this one, we're going to call say goodbye. We're going to say goodbye to, I don't know, Angie. And first we have to say hello, and then we'll say goodbye, right? So what greeting do we want to pass in? Well, we want to pass in just the normal say hello. Okay, so this says hello Angie because we passed in that function, right? This is the argument that gets stored in the parameter. This argument is a function, so we can just call it. So here greeting, we just called it like a function because that is what we passed in. We passed in a function. Okay, it's a first class citizen. So we passed in hello function and passed in Angie to that hello function, and so that's greeting. This is where greeting is being called. And then we did goodbye plus name, period. Right, so what if I did another greeting? I could say say goodbye to James. All right, and instead of say hello, I can pass in say howdy. All right, so if I run this, it's the same thing except this function dictates how we say hello. So I passed in say howdy. So this is really common in JavaScript to pass in functions as arguments to other functions. So you can do this in several programming languages, but it's not so common in any language as JavaScript. You use this literally all the time, and it's very important you learn about it right away. And a third way of doing this you might see a lot is say goodbye and we're going to say goodbye to David, but what is our greeting function? Let's say we don't want to use say hello or say howdy. We can define a function in line here. Okay, now look at this syntax. We've defined the first argument is David. So this is a function call, right? This is the say goodbye function. We're calling this function. We're passing in the argument David. That's getting stored in the name parameter. But for the next argument, we're just going to go ahead and define an anonymous function here. That's going to get stored in greeting. So rather than store our function in an identifier like we did up here, we're just going to pass in an anonymous function directly. This syntax you will see in JavaScript all the time, where you just pass in a function to another function call. All right, so this function is going to take a name parameter, just like the others, because we pass in a name here, and we're going to have a console.log. And we can say something like, welcome. Okay, so effectively, this anonymous function, it's the same as either one of these, because these identifiers say hello, they're just pointing to a function in memory. And what's actually getting passed in as the argument is the function, not this variable. It's the thing that this variable is holding, right? The thing that it points to. So here we're passing in actual functions. So that's really no different than what we're doing here. We're passing in a function. This one's anonymous. We haven't defined a name for it. Okay, so when we run this, let's see. Oh, I misspelled. Say goodbye. I need the E. There we go. And here it says welcome David, and then goodbye David. All right. So you'll see this syntax a whole lot. So this is a pretty brief but pretty good explanation of how functions work, how to define functions, the 3 different ways you can define functions. We talked about that. If we go back to our functions file, we have defining a function with the function keyword, right? Function, and then the identifier name, and then defining a function as a variable. Now, if you do it this way, you have to have an exclamation point at the end, where this way you don't. You should not have one, right? And then the third way is using the fat arrow syntax, right? And with that, you store it in a function as well, or in a variable name as well. Okay, and then to drive home the point that functions are first-class citizens, we defined some functions that take functions as arguments. Okay, so say goodbye takes in a greeting function and then calls that greeting function. But we don't know what this function is, at the time of defining this say goodbye function. We don't know what this greeting is going to be. It could be anything, right? So it's kind of powerful to be able to pass in functions to other functions. And you'll see this a whole lot in JavaScript. All right, so that should be enough for this one.